Hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Shivek Narang and I'm a full-time junior. I have a passion for neuroscience and I'm especially interested in studying the teenage brain and like how it grows and develops during our adolescent years. So, I wanted to start off, like if you did the last workshop actually, you may remember like how I talked about how the changes in the teenage brain, which occur during growth and adolescence years, lead to like side effects like impulsivity and recklessness. So I wanted to start off this presentation with a comparison between the adolescent and teenage brain, as shown in the graph here. Specifically talking about like the prefrontal cortex first. So like as you can see in the adult brain, the fully developed cortex which controls for judgment, decision making, impulse control, and emotions. But for teenagers, that region of the brain is still developing, as it is the last part of the brain to fully mature, and it says it fully matures at around 24 years of age. This whole process occurs while teenagers are trying to create their identity, and their identity will be very much guided by their interactions in these years, including the friendships they make. So, two more brain regions that are especially important are the hippocampus and amygdala. Or not hippocampus, sorry, my bad, the hypothalamus. And so many of you might have heard of the hypothalamus as the region of your brain that controls like homeostasis, and it plays a role in your endocrine system. But it also regulates emotions, including aggression, some levels of pleasure, and also makes sure regulating your autonomic nervous system, which controls your involuntary behaviors like heartbeat and pulse. The other important region is the amygdala, which means almond because apparently it does look like an almond according to scientists. And this region is the emotional control center of your body, and it predominantly is responsible for the feelings of anger and aggression. And in fact, studies have shown that removing the amygdala removes such feelings of fear and anger in individuals. And so these are three of the main brain regions, and I want to introduce a final pathway in the brain. It's called the reward pathway. So the reward pathway consists of a series of brain regions, including the prefrontal cortex, which get activated by certain behaviors that bring you happiness and pleasure. When you perform an action that brings like happiness in the reward pathway, regions of this pathway will release dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter often known as like the pleasure neurotransmitter, and it leads to you feeling really happy and full of pleasure. And this dopamine rush, when you feel this feeling of happiness, you're gonna start to want this dopamine rush even more, and this kind of leads to the feeling of addiction. And drugs and alcohol, they misuse this pathway, making you get extremely addicted to them, so you keep on using them over and over again. So now, keeping these ideas in mind, let's talk about friendship and loneliness. So, loneliness has many side effects, right? So you can see that people who are feeling lonely tend to suffer from cardiac problems, along with stress and a lot of mental difficulties, including decreased memory. And in fact, some studies show that when isolation, it increases cancer tumor growth, and it also increases the presence of tumors. So people who live a lot of time in isolation and loneliness have a higher predisposition to cancer. Another study found that the effects of loneliness are equal on par with the effects of smoking and obesity, and we know that these diseases and like conditions, they have a lot of impact on our body, and they're all negative effects. And the fact that they're on par with isolation and loneliness is a really big issue. It also often leads to stress, as we mentioned before. But one thing that I found really interesting is this idea of social chills. So it was a study in which two people were placed in environments of the exact same temperature, but they were also given like photo albums to look at. One which is like a happy memory, one which is a sad memory, and people who were in the room with the people who were not isolated and had a lot of social interactions, they were able to feel warmer while looking at the pictures of happiness, while those who were in those people who were in the room with the same temperature but were isolated tended to feel colder even though they were looking at happy pictures. So it associates like it's a social chill in the way because this did actually feel colder even though they're in the same temperature. And it seems like isolation and loneliness does have something to do with that. That's something interesting, which is also important to keep in mind. And again, just going back to the effects of loneliness, as I mentioned earlier, 92% of people find it difficult to tell others they're lonely. 8 out of 10 of us feel judged like negatively for saying that we're feeling lonely. People in Britain, for 1 out of 4 of them, know someone who's lonely. 7 in 10 people know a friend who's lonely. And two main ones I want to talk about as well is, as I mentioned earlier, loneliness is worse for us than obesity, and lonely people are 64% more likely to develop dementia. And dementia is basically any group of diseases which involves memory like degeneration and loss of like basically brain functions in the future, and Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia. Another infographic is that people who are lonely are more likely to develop depression, and they're also more likely to develop heart diseases. It's also comparable with smoking 15 cigarettes a day, which is an insanely large amount of cigarettes. So again, recapping all of those side effects is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day, equivalent to being an alcoholic, more harmful than not exercising, twice as harmful as obesity, more likely to develop depression, and less likely and way more likely to develop dementia. So again, these summarize just some of the effects of loneliness. And this is not like once in a while feeling lonely, but this is like continual feelings of loneliness. And it also has effects on the brain because there's this gene called TAC1, and that gene produces a protein called tachykinin. And actually, this was just discovered recently, like within the last 2 years. And what this protein does is it binds to regions of the brain like the amygdala and hypothalamus, as I described above, and it leads to feelings of depression and aggression. As it, like when it binds to those regions, they're not able to be expressed as well, and even the amygdala is gonna be like more activated in a way, which leads to increased feelings of aggression, since increased activation of the amygdala leads to increased aggression. There's also long-term effects, because what I mentioned above was a short-term effect, but a long-term effect is that people who have more social connections as teenagers tend to have less mental health connections than their adults, because actually they performed a study of like observing people over time, and they observed there was higher depression rates in adults who lacked social connections in middle and high school. So that's something to keep in mind for us right now as high schoolers, is that social connections are definitely really important to have, as they will impact our life in the future. And again, as I mentioned several times, loneliness is associated with more than double the risk of developing late life dementia, including Alzheimer's disease. But the thing is, everyone can feel lonely at some time, right? Like some even if you're in a crowd, it's possible to feel lonely in the crowd. And sometimes feeling once in a while loneliness, it's not like amazing, I guess. It's not a good thing, but it isn't gonna have the effects that chronic or long term loneliness have as well. The things, all the side effects I mentioned above are the results of long term loneliness, but that isn't to say that it's not possible to like stop the feeling of loneliness, because as George Clooney, the celebrity, said, that anyone will be lonely for saying they don't anyone will be lying if they don't get lonely at times, because even if you're in a crowd, sometimes you can feel lonely because you may feel like isolated or different than everyone else. But how do you deal with it? There's many ways to deal with it, right? So for some people, it's hanging out with friends, like in the first picture, they're taking a picture with their friends, their coworkers. Maybe it's your pet. If you have a cat or a dog, sometimes they make you feel less lonely. Reading a book, or watching TV, like watching Friends, like the funny comedy show. Like writing, exercising, running. There's a whole sort of things that you can do, whatever you find most interesting, to help deal with loneliness. And as going back to like this recurrent theme of being socially connected, it'll maintain your brain health, right? Because neuroscience research shows that people who have more leisure activities, more basically like, for example, volunteering or pursuing your hobbies like reading, writing, playing a sport, all of these people who would follow these activities have a lower risk of developing dementia. And these activities including visited friends, playing cards, or volunteer work. Also, people with larger social networks, and by larger social networks, I don't mean like follower count on like Instagram or Twitter, but rather people who you can interact with, your friends who you connect with, and as someone described them, your bowling friends who you're comfortable taking to a bowling game with. Having those larger social networks will have a lower risk of dementia. So, how do friends impact our brain health, right? And there's a variety of theories, but there's this one common idea of cognitive reserve. And basically, what that means is how resistant your mind is to damage of deterioration of the brain. And basically, it's saying that socializing is like strengthens your cognitive reserve, and it makes you less prone to basically brain deterioration in the future, and it prevents and protects you against dementia as well. So talking about friendships, it's really important to preserve the friendships you have with people, right? If there's someone you care and trust about, don't lose them. It's really hard to find people who are just like you and share many of your interests. Make the friends that you trust, the people who you're really close with, it's important to always keep them in mind. Like for us as well, I used to go to a brick and mortar school last year, and even though now I go to Stanford online full time, I still am in touch with some of my close friends from my previous school, and I still communicate with them because I don't want to lose my friendship with those people. But it's also important to be wary of certain aspects of friendship, including peer pressure. So it's important not to succumb to peer pressure because once you do, it's like almost a one-way road with with almost no way back. Um, More often than not, peer pressure can be damaging because it leads you to do things which you may or may not believe in or are morally incorrect, and this leads to the reward pathway. So, as you mentioned above, remember the reward pathway leads to feelings of addiction, and people feel happiness and pleasure. And many times, things that your peers may pressure you into are things that, for example, the common cases of like feeling peer pressure into taking drugs or alcohol, and these definitely, when they get reinforced in your reward system, you get addicted, and doing it after you do it once, it's really hard to stop. So this is again like damaging to your brain, and in the future it'll lead to constant craving and desire for more. And all these activities, they don't really provide any benefit to you. In fact, they deteriorate your brain and other parts of your body. So it's important to like stay wary of peer pressure and make sure not to fall victim to this pathway. Um, so socializing is the prescription for brain well-being, right? So it's often hard in online schools, but find people who share similar passions as you: sports, art stands, even music. A lot of my friends I made up because we like the same music. Or if you do volunteer work, people you meet there, keep in touch with them. Make use of like the OHS meetups like Startup, Pixel Fest, and all these will help you make friends, stay connected to one another, increase your social circle, and that'll definitely help you in the future as well. And I just want to thank you for listening to my presentation because your brain will thank you as well in the future. So thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Shivek, for doing the presentation. Yeah, let me join in. Well,